Hello, this is Hit Pause, a podcast made in San Francisco with more questions than answers. Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Hit Pause. Today, we continue our journey through understanding and looking at the different ways that the virality on social media can be controlled. We started posing the essence of a metaphor of social media and a nuclear reactor in the last two episodes. Today's episode will be a little bit more technical as I look at with you into the history of the laws and regulations and ways that the social media so-called platforms, or sometimes publishers, sometimes built-in boards, have been looked at historically, and a little bit of a very fast flyover the legislations that are to come. And through that little journey, we'll see that there is very little that the legislator really looks at from the perspective of the health and the veracity of the news that are traveling through the social media channels. So before we get to the end of this season 1 and a couple of conclusions with this exploration of media, I want to look therefore into the different phases that over the past two waves of media changes that we've experienced over the past 2 decades, what are the phases that we have observed? I categorize them, if you will, into 3 phases that have occurred each time, whether we went from the narrowband communication over the modem with the Minitel initially, then the advent of the internet and the first wave of the internet web pages that then led the creation of new formats, at the time the built-in board, and the evolution and the growth of those phases of those new medium. And those phases are, number 1, a phase of laissez-faire, followed too by a phase of regulation, and third, a phase of economic questioning. So I'll come back with the laissez-faire. It's pretty clear that there is in our capitalistic systems, and certainly in the Silicon Valley, a implicit bias by the capitalistic system and the legislator that innovation is good and at least morally neutral in technology. We see that time and time again. By definitions, innovators or inventors bring a novelty to the human brain that is delightful. When you remember yourself as a kid, we'll explore all of this in the season 2 of Hit Pause. We are delighted. There is a intrinsic pleasure at discovering novel sensations. When we're kids, of course, the sensations are many. May they be the discovery of the new taste of a food, of a drink. They can be bitter, but we discover novelty through all our senses. and certainly through our apprehension of concepts and the world. And it's the same with new technology, new ways of thinking about something. There is a inherent human excitement and passion at creation, at the advent of a new way of doing something. In the early episodes of Hit Pause, we looked at the advent of TiVo and the magic of time shifting. At some point of time, it became possible to pause the broadcast TV feed, and suddenly the pure wonder of being able to do that helped create a new consumer, a new television viewer behavior. And so the implicit bend of the acceptance by the legislator, by society, of new technologies, of new improvements is typically biased towards letting things happen. And typically, novelty, innovation is always occurring in a phase of what I would call regulatory laissez-faire, to use the French term, which means live and let live, if you will, in English, or let the market forces shape what the outcome will be. And in that phase, the new companies, the new websites, the new social media platforms emerge with the ability to innovate, develop new capabilities in absolute freedom. This positive to neutral bias is clearly the foundation of a lot of innovation in the Silicon Valley, and explains why every other years I get to see a new arrival of entrepreneurs from Europe, from France, who come precisely to find in the Silicon Valley that fertile space of freedom for inventing, for disrupting, and of course, to find access to capital. And so the early phases of social media companies, really, whether we're talking about Friendster in its time, MySpace in its time, were mirrored by the early phases and the laissez-faire phases that saw the advent of YouTube and later on Facebook, that was initially only restricted to college campuses. Those companies actually at the root typically have a social good mission to bring novelty, to bring communication, to bring connectivity to the human race. Sometimes it's not expressed as the human race. Obviously, the early years of Facebook were really meant to be a corporate campus utility that then had proven its ability to connect pretty much virtually everyone on a corporate campus. And so the model was, how do we go beyond that? And sometime during the transition of those businesses, as they grow, as they seek more and more usage, the question of the monetization occurs, and those businesses typically will design a business model that is to leverage and monetize that usage. And what is nothing more than a model of monetization of user and consumer attention as advertising. That's one of the business models that we see in social media. Obviously, I'm stating the obvious. Another one could be a conversion of some of the users to a paying model. And there we have the business models of Flickr. We have the business models of PhotoBucket, which is now a forgotten name of the Silicon Valley. We have the monetization of LinkedIn, which historically grew and made money from the conversion of some of the users and the injection of corporate sponsorship and corporate professional fees on the recruiting side and bringing in recruiter profiles, as well as the ability to package some premium features into a pay model for premium users. The same business model goes for Evernote and countless others. And so those companies have to come up with a decision at some point of time in their evolution as to which is the business model that they will pick. And that decision is essentially a intrinsically moral decision, I would argue, much more than a economic decision. And by moral, I mean that decisions of the business model will tilt the relationship around the end user as to whether the true customer of that company ends up being the end user itself or a corporate benefactor, a corporate customer that will ultimately shape and dictate the evolution of the business. Other companies also take a third route, which is the licensing of data into the corporate world. An example of a company like this is IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, which, after having created a consumer application and service and seeded some data, leveraged and grew out of the user-based curation and creation of information, leveraged that information into a business offering. And I personally worked in my past for a company called the Related Content Database, which was trying to bring in very sophisticated and time-based data to follow the timeline of a movie. And that business-to-business business model later fueled the feature X-Ray, which is now found on the Amazon Prime movie watching experience. So when the business relationship and the monetization phase of the business brings the business to a level of success defined by a growth of the user base to levels that start being important, obviously they start becoming part of the social fabric of the internet. And they there encountered over the past 20 years the emergence, of course, of legislations and regulations, or the adaptation thereof, of a book of laws applying to safe content and child pornography, intrastate commerce, the ability to tax specific activities in intrastate commerce with Amazon, and the conversation around what is the taxability of a sale of an object from one state to another state, and so on. And so that second phase is typically very targeted at a capitalistic view of the social media business and its well behavior in the economic fabric of society. And there is a constant chain of custody of the regulations that descends all the way down to the end user for the acceptance of the terms of service and the privacy policy and the respect of the community behavior. Where it is important to also notice that by far and large, the terms and conditions of a service are a all or nothing type of approach. And if you refuse to accept the terms and conditions, the full access to the service is actually denied by the service provider. That's important in my mind in the sense that I am not aware at this stage of companies that provide a gradient of options. Obviously, we all want to abide by the law, but what about the exploitation of data for certain purposes in advertising or not? We'll come back to that in a future episode. So the phase one is laissez-faire. That spurs the growth and which is inherently driven by innovation. The second phase is the phase of the growth, which is to orchestrate a certain economic and legalistic behavior of the growth of the business. The third phase is a phase where the more complex questions occur as to what is the nature of the business. Was AOL a built-in board company, or was it a publisher responsible for the content? Is Apple Podcast responsible for the content of the podcasts, or just responsible for the curation of the content, the podcasts, as they pertain to the respect of their terms of service? Those questions are not necessarily obvious, and we are now seeing the emergence of self-guided initiatives by some of the large platform companies, especially as the COVID conspiracy theories are now flourishing on the social networks. On my website, utesa.com/podcast, you'll be able to see, related to this episode, a series of resources and internet links towards articles covering and explaining what Twitter and Facebook and YouTube have, for example, done to mitigate on their own the virality of those fake news, of those toxic pieces of information. In that sense, you can argue that the boron rods of that social nuclear reactions, some of them are trying to be put in place, arguably with more or less success, by the platform companies and the social media companies. It is an important, I would argue, maybe novel, but surely timid and encouraging new movement to see those companies attempt to do something. But it is also very clear that we see a huge gamut of responses, all the way from the removal of content, which is dubious, to just a flagging of content, which is dubious. And that's an important point, because I argue that as the power of social media continues its inexorable march in our society, the responses that social media companies need to have facing toxic material will have to become more and more efficient, because we are now in a phase where the ability for toxic material to take over most of the bandwidth, the media bandwidth, the reception bandwidth of the receptors of the system, i.e. us, is now disproportionately exponential to and commensurate to that exponential networking of all the players in the system. Put simply, we are all connected. We are all touching social media as well as broadcast media. We are continuously bombarded by messages, and therefore it is very, very easy for toxic messaging to reach and take an inordinate proportion of the media market. And now, let's go to a short break to hit pause, reflect, or just continue. And welcome back to the second part of today's episode. We saw just now the structure of the rapport between a new medium or a new format in media to the set of regulations and requirements that society imposes on them. 3 phases of laissez-faire, of economic boundaries, and then a questioning on what is the adjustment, if you will, or the engagement of those media platforms and their role towards their content. In this second part, let's look a little bit at where this is headed. Today, when you look at the next wave of regulation of social media, which is upon us, one could imagine that the governments are asking themselves, how do I impose a responsibility and even further responsibility on the social media platform companies as they bring us into the next 10 years of this delicate, maybe tenuous rapport with democracy and the political system. Well, I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but what I see out there is mostly a evolution into a finessing, a economic-driven optimization of the relationship between the platforms and the content providers, but that fundamentally that redesigning of the regulatory environment in which the social media companies are asked to evolve is essentially economically driven and not societal or politically or morally driven. Let me explain. The largest debate out there in the relationship between social media and the economic actors is shaped by a central essential question, which is the rapport of the world towards those two large behemoth companies that the social media world has created or has been created by them and by Google and Facebook. Arguably, Amazon and Apple could also be put in that light, but Amazon and Apple have very different business targets or business models, one being driven by e-commerce transactions, the other one by the sale of physical goods. Only Google and Facebook are today mostly driven by intangible exchange of intellectual property between the users that provide their data and customers that provide their dollars. And so the world economic regulators have been looking at that relationship between the customers of those companies themselves, and the end users, i.e. ourselves. If we look at where the European Union is headed, we need to look at what is called the European Union Article 13, which actually is now the Article 17. It has been renamed, of the digital commerce initiatives, if you will, that are being put in place now at the European Union level and at the EU member states level. Article 17 is basically a set of rules and regulations that is meant and shaped to profoundly redesign the relationship between social media companies and the originators of an article. To put it very simply, today Google and Facebook do not have, or Twitter, do not have to pay the BBC to put a link, or each time a user of Google or Facebook or Twitter puts a link to an article of the BBC on their post. That is the fundamental principle of social media platform companies as neutral platforms where the end user themselves is free to link, forward, share, and post. The current copyright laws, which in the United States have been put in place in the last 2 decades, the so-called DMCA, Digital Copyright Millennial Act, are really saying something simpler, which is to say you're responsible to make sure that if a piece of material is copyrighted, you either remove it or you seek the attribution of that material. Here, the European Union is going one step further, which is to say that the content owner, the article publisher, has to be compensated for that link. Obviously, this is a momentous and monumental change in how the virality, the original seeding of an article would be occurring on social media. A couple of countries in Europe have already taken steps to put in place regulations, and that will be the implementation level regulations in support of compliance with the European Union Article 17. And compliance needs to put in place before June 2017. France and the Netherlands have been the first ones to say that they will implement those regulations. Interestingly enough, Australia is starting to make statements to the effect that they will follow the same guiding principles than the European Union. The United Kingdom has already stated that they will not put in place that regulation. Of course, the United Kingdom has already, as we all know, gone to the Brexit route. The United States itself is looking at taking a softer stance and is taking right now a wait-and-see attitude, but the Senate has started running committees and hearings to bring all the different parties to the table and to hear the different voices, from the social media companies to the smaller content producers. But my point in this very brief expose of what are the next wave of regulations that will cover social media is that they are fundamentally economically driven. They try to touch the balance of power between a platform company, a so-called platform company, that's how they call themselves, a social media company, and the content company. If you are a content provider, of course, a small content provider, you will be happy to look at the prospect of getting a check each time one of your followers posts a link to your website. But the implementation of such a system is quite complex, and it remains to be seen what the practical implementations, what are the practical changes to the economy and the technology infrastructure of social media companies will become. But back to my point again, there is very little in this next wave of regulations that are upon us in the space of social media that really addresses the core fundamental question, which is the way that our medium, our democracy, lives and bathes in this fabric of social media conversation, which is incessant, and the establishment of the famous boron rods that slow down the virality of toxic material. There is very little that addresses this fundamental question, I believe, which is how do you ensure that over time the quality of the content increases, that the exposure to a higher and higher number of receptors of people to valuable content increases? Are we at a threat of having social media drown in the constant sharing of toxic material? Those are the questions that the politicians should be asking, and we'll see in the next episode what our role is in that dialogue. This podcast is a simple way of sharing my thoughts. It is a personal endeavor, nothing more, a way to connect. The views and opinions represented in this podcast are solely mine. They are in no way, nor should they be assumed to be shared, supported, endorsed by my employer, the sponsors of this show, Anchor.fm, where it is hosted, and all the distributors thereof. You may find more information, links, pictures, videos, documents, and more, which may have been referenced in this podcast, on my website at www.utesa.com/podcast. There, it feels so much better after saying all of this. And so, it's time to part ways, at least for now. Until next time, time to say goodnight, time to hit pause.